Assalamu alaikum and good evening. My name is Yusuf Ismail and the program you're watching is I Beg to Differ. This is a program which focuses on interactive debate on socio-economic, political, cultural and religious issues affecting us as South Africans, and certainly looking and examining at some of the global dominant trends in the international community. The land reform debate has reached a crescendo in South African society in recent months, with polarization on both the left and the right. Today we continue part 2 of the ongoing debate on land reform and also look at the systematic increase in farm murders in South African society. Well, joining me to discuss this controversial and contentious issue, I'm joined in the studios by Advocate Andrew Duminy from the Christian Lawyers Association. Welcome. It's good to have you back. And joining us via Skype from Middelburg, we're joined by Ian Cameron, who is the National Head of Community Safety at AfriForum. Ian, are you there?
Yes, I can
Yes,
hear you.
Ian, welcome. Well, it's good to have you, Ian, and we want to thank you for your time in taking off and participating in this particular debate.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I apologize for the delay.
It's a pleasure. Let me start off with you, Advocate Duminy. We had this discussion last week, and one of the issues that basically raised is that the reality, certainly there were opposing views from AZAPO, but that the reality is that this idea of land reform and the particular context in which we find ourselves is not as bleak as the far left or perhaps the far right seem to portray. What would your perspective be on that?
I agree. I think that the reality is that there's tremendous goodwill in this country and we need to move forward. It's written into our constitution that we're going to do land reform. We've agreed to do it. And the major role players are actually engaging actively in it. We've seen tremendous engaging from Agri-SA. We've seen commitments, we've seen from the presidency numerous commitments, but we are being polarized, and I'm very concerned about the polarization.
So when you speak about polarization, I'm going to get Ian in. When you speak, you're saying polarized from the left and the right in society. If you can use these terms loosely.
Well, that's my take on it at the moment, and I think we've got two voices on both sides of the spectrum who are crying and who are both looking at things very, very differently, and society is actually dividing sharply on it. And that's very concerning to me, and I think we need to move in a different direction.
Well, Ian, let me bring you in. Ian, you're part of AfriForum, and AfriForum is purportedly a civil rights movement, a civil rights organization, but as I understand it, primarily set up to protect the rights of Afrikaner people. Would I be correct?
That's correct.
So here's the situation. Recently, there's been movements, particularly by your CEO, Kali Kriel, and Ernst Rutz, who is the deputy CEO, in having trips to the United States, trips to Australia by yourself recently. I think I've seen one of your clips on Sky News. And the kind of discourse, as we see that is being presented, is the fact that in South Africa there is an unprecedented hike in terms of land grabs, and at some level, a systematic genocide of what can be viewed as genocide of white farmers. Would you view that perspective as correct or somewhat exaggerated?
Well, I think first of all, there's a misperception that's been created specifically from the United States visit that Kali Kriel and Ernst Rutz completed, that we spoke about genocide, and especially certain media institutions in South Africa all jumped on the bandwagon and started calling something genocide that no one has called genocide. Simply what we said was that there's a unique group of people, a specific group that play a crucial role in the sustainable economy of a country, that play a crucial role in feeding a country, and that disproportionately are being hurt and tortured in some of these farm attacks. And we're simply saying that government should pay attention to this. We're not even asking for special treatment, we simply ask for equal treatment. And a lot of people say, why don't we speak to government? And at that stage, and even a few years ago, President Zuma was still in power, and we had seven discussions in total during his presidency with him, and not once, was there a negative discussion. Every discussion was very positive, and it made everyone feel very good. but nothing came from it. And it's the same with the whole land issue. We've had so many discussions, we've spoken with the ANC, we've spoken with many different institutions and organizations, but the promises that are made by the ANC and the perception that is created by the Constitutional Review Committee that the voice of the person on the ground does count is inaccurate. And that's the frustration point that we've reached, that it's important to tell the global arena what is going on in South Africa, and to try and use that momentum to also then put pressure on the South African government to realize that they can't just look after themselves, but they have to also regard the entire South African civilization.
Okay, Ian, here's the issue, and I understand the point, and I certainly endorse the point that pressure groups, organizations, they've got the right to look after the interests of, for example, minority communities and so on. But the critique that is basically being presented is that AfriForum does in fact consider rights of minorities, but in many instances does this in an isolationist and exclusionary way, in a way and manner that does not benefit, for example, 55 million other ordinary South Africans who may obviously be under the same kind of scourge that basically is experienced by Afrikaners. I mean, one of the things which I need to basically raise and certainly challenge is that in the visit to the United States, and I think the meeting with John Bolton, your deputy CEO, for example, stated that the ANC and the EFF alliance was pursuing a communist agenda based on lies and deception. Now, here's a problem. The ANC, and in fact, one could argue even the EFF, are so infested with the scourge of capitalism that to even, in fact, describe them as communists is an insult to communism and socialism. The argumentation basically presented is that this is a communist agenda at fore, and there is an agenda to take away the land of all white people in general, when in reality the ANC has not just failed Afrikaner people, but they failed the whole of society over the past 24 years. A lot of those that have basically been at the consequential negative policies of the ANC are in fact black people. So why not incorporate that as part of your discourse?
No, I think you've got your facts completely incorrect. No one said that it's specifically targeted at whites, especially not AfriForum. In fact, we went and said that this is a negative influence on the entire country. And it's quite simple why there's a communist influence. If you listen what is being said amongst not only the EFF, but also the ANC, the EFF just 2 days ago said that land should be nationalized. That's a communist principle. That's nothing to do with capitalism. We see that Julius Malema has very close ties with COSATU, as does the ANC. COSATU is a majority communist institution. You look at someone like Lady Zamandi, who leads the South African Communist Party. So saying that it's an insult to communism, that's a statement that should be discussed on another day. But the fact that there's some form of a communist influence on the ANC and the EFF is completely true, and I think disregarding that or saying that it's not true means that we are walking around with covers over our eyes, because it's quite clear, and they admit it quite openly. I don't need to debate or discuss the merit of communism or not. The fact of the matter is the way and the suggestions that they are making at the moment as to how to divide land is something that's not benefiting the poor South African, because that poor South African will not get a title deed for that land, as they have proved in the past 25 years with land reform. We need to go and look at this and see how it can carry some sort of an advantage for every South African, regardless of their race, culture, or creed.
Okay, Advocate Dumini, just bringing you in, this idea which is being presented that there's some sort of communist agenda at play, is that sustainable from your perspective? I mean, seeing the fact that the ANC, and I'm not saying it in a positive fashion, but the ANC in general has for the past 24 years viciously and aggressively imposed neoliberal, ultra-right capitalist policies in this country to the detriment of the majority of the population. Even though I understand that ideologically they claim to be socialist, communist, and so on, the reality on the ground was big business, big capital, to the detriment of society in general. What's your perspective on that?
Well, I think the mere fact that the ANC has rejected the EFF's proposal on nationalizing all land tells us that they're not following a communist agenda.
But I mean the EFF are in fact if you can call ANC the kind of strongholders of corruption, the EFF are in fact graduates of that same university. And I mean, looking at the issue with the VBS Bank and the looting that took place, I mean, individually, these seem to be operate on capitalist principles, although they portray the idea that they're engaging in a socialist agenda. These are very much individuals wanting to fulfill their own pockets.
It seems that everybody's trying to get as rich as quickly as possible in this country and will do whatever they can to get as rich as quickly. But it's not a reflection of communism. And I think the days of what we would call in the old days the Rooi Gevaar are somewhat gone. And I think that some of the ideology that's fueling this debate is old ideology and perhaps fear-mongering and possibly even warmongering, and we can go into that. But I think,
well, when you say fear-mongering, warmongering, by who? Are you saying AfriForum is contributing to that?
I think both the left extreme and the right extreme are both driving an agenda, and the other groups as well, who are actually polarizing society by dividing us and saying, well, this is the agenda there. People aren't meeting each other. People aren't discussing. I have more and more people asking me, well, you know, what's the future here? Are we all going to be, as white people, wiped out in South Africa? And I say, well, is that what you're hearing from the extreme groups? And when I engage with some people from the extreme left, I hear that. And I hear the same from the extreme
well, groups
right.
like AfriForum, I mean, as Ian stated, don't actually put forth that idea that there is a white genocide. I don't know, maybe perhaps implicit. But let me just bring this out to you, Ian. I think a month or two ago, Associate Law Professor Elmine du Plessis, I think from the University of Pretoria, she's a law professor, she critiqued and looked at some of the statistics of white farmers that were being in fact killed. And her argument, and maybe I think both of you are probably on the same ground, is that her argument was that these statistics obviously don't support the claim of white genocide, which are probably being made by people like groups like Suidlanders and so on. And afterwards, Elmine du Plessis started receiving threatening phone calls and so on. So on the one hand, certainly these are important issues to look at, but the idea that I'm getting from groups like AfriForum and looking at the side, there's two-pronged issue, land expropriation, murdering of white farmers. The idea I'm getting from you, and certainly in the writings of Ernst Roots, is that the white farmers being murdered are very much politically motivated, and that there's a political element. In fact, I think he gave the argument that in 2010, at the time of the World Cup, basically there was a kind of a stop in terms of farm killings, and then subsequent to that, the farm murders started increasing. Is that the idea that you seem to be getting when you're talking about farm murders, that this is politically motivated at the highest level?
Well, I think first of all, I say that with the utmost respect. I think my learned colleague sitting on the other side is creating the idea that AfriForum is a far-right group. And I think it's important just to set the record straight for the sake of this interview that AfriForum is a balanced organization, and we feel very strongly about the fact that there should be respect, honor, and dignity restored between all different cultural groups throughout the country. To create the impression that racial groups are being polarized by an organization like AfriForum is utter nonsense. AfriForum just last week actually presented anti-hijacking training for SA United Against Crime in the middle of Soweto, as we've done all over the Eastern Cape. In the Western Cape, we are providing technology and applications to use in the Cape Flats against gang violence. So it's interesting to see that even in this discussion, there's always a slight lingering to try and insinuate something about AfriForum that's not true.
Okay.
Regarding
Well,
Ian, accurate. I've got the police statistics in front of me as we speak. I've also got some of the agricultural union statistics, as I do those statistics from AfriForum. And it's quite clear that there's a unique group being targeted. Now, from AfriForum's side, the statistics that we mention, the statistics that we speak about across the globe and in South Africa, include people from all racial categories. And from
Ian, just to stop, Ian, I just have to interrupt you. Ian, can you hear me?
Ian operates or fits in with that of the South African Police Service. That only between 7 and 8% of people who are attacked, rather killed on farms in South Africa are workers, and more than 65% are the farmers themselves. The difference is mostly visitors and then obviously direct family. This means to say that out of the 32,000 agricultural specialists...
Ian, we're going to probe that. We have to go for a quick ad break, Ian. I think there's a sound... Ian, I have to stop you there, Ian. If you can hear me...
more chance of being killed on a farm than a police official does in South Africa.
Okay.
In fact, it's 156 per 100,000 murder rate compared to the 56 per 100,000 murder rate of the police themselves. So it's important that we consider statistics not only from a group like AfriForum or not only from the EFF or the ANC, but that we have an objective look at police statistics as well. And I get the impression that, we're simply having emotional arguments, which is important not to have. We need to consider the facts. And if we look at agriculture in South Africa at the moment, and we consider the threat that farmers face, it's a fact that farmers are under threat in South Africa and that we will not have food to eat if we don't protect the farmers that we have. The last bit I would like to say...
Okay, Ian, I'll have to stop you. Ian, we have to go for an ad break. Ian,
that are responsible for...
Could I just come in there, Ian? I think there's some sort of communication problem on your side.
And they've got the type of threat that farmers face in the country. I'm sure they will receive priority attention because the energy sector is being threatened in the country. But now, because it's farmers and there's a supposed, and I say that in exclamation marks, there's supposed, political connotation, we don't see them receiving any attention. In fact, they've deprioritized it in the past 10 to 15 years.
Okay, Ian, can I stop you there, Ian, because we have to go for an ad break, and we have to go for an ad break quickly. I'll have to stop you on that point. I think there's a communication problem. Ian, I have to stop you, Ian, because we have to go for an ad break. There's limited time we've got, and I think there's some sort of communication in terms of you not being able to hear us, but we just got limited time. We're going to be back shortly. I'm going to have to ask you to be brief, and also Advocate Dumini, because our time is limited. We'll be back shortly. Welcome back to I Beg to Differ. I'm your host, Yusuf Ismail, and we engage in a robust debate with Advocate Dumini and Ian Cameron from AfriForum. I'm just going to ask both my guests to be as brief as possible and succinct and to the point, because I think there seems to be some sort of disturbance in terms of hearing and communication. Advocate Dumini, just to point this out, the argument and the gist of what Ian was indicating and alluding was the fact that you possibly engaging in a form of a polemic against AfriForum. Is that what you're doing? That labeling them far right, in fact, detracts from, in a way, addressing some of the arguments being made by them or raised by them?
I think what I'm picking up on is a public perception, and this is rather dangerous.
Yeah.
And if AfriForum are adamant that they are not aligning themselves with the far right in any way, we need to see efforts. And he's mentioned a number of efforts, and that's wonderful to hear, that AfriForum is actually distancing themselves from it. But unfortunately, they start out by saying that they are an Afrikaner rights protection movement. And that immediately puts us into a particular box.
Now, you're an Afrikaner. Do you find, as an Afrikaner, Advocate Dumini, do you find that offensive?
I find it offensive that all Afrikaners are immediately associated with the right wing. And that disturbs me. It disturbs me that we are immediately put in boxes. But it happens. It's part of the South African dynamic. And it's unfortunate. I do not want to be associated with right-wing politics. I have a difference and I have great difficulty with a number of the statements that are made.
Yeah, let's probe into that. I'm going to get Ian to comment on that, but let's probe into that. What in your mind, because he's trying to distance himself from the far right, but what in your mind would seem to suggest that this is an association with the far right? What aspect of AfriForum in terms of their discourse do you basically object to?
I think we're talking about at least an impression that's created of one particular group that's being protected, and one particular group whose interests are being motivated and whose interests are being put in the international arena. I don't think that we should be doing that in South Africa anymore. I think we should be talking about ourselves as the country, as South Africans. As soon as we say we are Afrikaners and this is what we do, we are immediately starting to polarize. And that in itself is a very dangerous part of our current national debate. It gives groups on the far left the ammunition to start shooting. And I think we need to start integrating more. We need to start talking more about what the various interests are of the whole community.
So now the far right and the far left are polarizing themselves, but actually are playing off against each other. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I see. And the point is the rest in the middle are getting swept up in both directions. And I think that's very dangerous for us as a country.
I mean, that is the point, Ian. And just to bring you in now, and again, I'm going to ask both of you to be quick and brief as possible, and then we're going to move on and probe some of the issues. Some of the associations that AfriForum has had, for example, some of the media interviews that your deputy CEO and Kali Kriel has engaged in, has been in many instances with individuals on the far right. I'll take an example. I mean, Ernst Roots, just some months back, and I think twice, he's engaged in a live, I think, podcast chat with someone called Stefan Molyneux. If you know Stefan Molyneux is a far-right philosopher. One of the arguments that he generally presents is this whole notion, for example, that black people are intellectually more inferior than whites. Your own CEO, Kali Kriel, I mean, he's on record as, for example, stating that apartheid is not a crime against humanity, but it was wrong. Now the point is that when you have these kind of associations, and when you have, for example, statements, maybe they're taken out of context, but when these statements are then seen, then the very legitimacy of your organization, the fact that there is not a lot of integration with the rest of society, I mean, looking at all farmers' rights, black and white, these raise questions on the credibility of your organization and go in a long way to impede negatively. I mean, the Parliamentary Review Committee on Land Reform, every single political party out there lambasted AfriForum on the land reform debate. And so on all these issues and pointers, Ian, don't you see that the modus operandi you want to engage in, the civil rights struggle that you want to engage in is in a sense lost when all these other side elements come to the fore and are seen as problematic?
Yeah, let me start with the following. I would like to ask my colleague on the other side, are people allowed to call themselves Zulu? Are they allowed to call themselves Tutu or Tswana or whatever the culture might be? I think it's an absolutely absurd statement that's completely in contradiction with our constitution, that you immediately create space between yourself and others when you call yourself an Afrikaner. That means that Jews aren't allowed to be Jews. You are not allowed to have ITV as Islam TV. We shouldn't have that anymore because that means it polarizes people. It means that the Black Management Forum shouldn't exist. It also means that we shouldn't be correcting the injustices of the past. In fact, we shouldn't even be looking at land reform because it might benefit one group more than the other. So to say that, I would debunk it completely. Your statement just now that we do not integrate with the rest of society is very far from the truth. In fact, I would like to challenge you and my learned friend on the other side to come and spend a little bit of time with AfriForum, and you would see that we are now the biggest community safety organization in the entire country, with a completely mixed group of people who patrol their communities on a daily basis, every single night, every single day. In fact, just in the past year, AfriForum has trained over 2,500 people. We've got 7.9 thousand patrollers in the country that are trained and registered with the organization. We've fixed more than 16,000 potholes in the past year that benefits all people in the country. So I think it's time that media, maybe even institutions like yourself and my learned colleague on the other side, start looking at the media in a balanced way and that don't read Almin Duplessis articles that create a false impression. Maybe it's time to go and look at Daily Maverick. It's time to listen to the Renegade Report, read the Bild and Arisphere, and then go and read Huffington Post and create a mixed and objective view. Instead of creating an AfriForum debate, let's see how AfriForum is already advantaging different people in the country and how we can work together. Because I think it's happened far too much that we're always having the AfriForum debate, instead of seeing how we can start working together for a more sustainable future. Because at the moment, I see too many people, and unfortunately, in this interview, yourself to a certain extent, that's creating a polarizing impact of AfriForum and the rest, where that's not the truth at all.
Okay.
AfriForum has a very stern public policy that we've got open doors for everyone.
Okay, Ian, that's fine. I accept the point. Ian, can you hear me?
Organization that
Yes.
gives people study loans and study bursaries because of merit and not because of the color of their skin.
Okay, Ian, can you hear me? I have to stop you there. Ian, please, could I come in? I need to stop you there. Ian.
Why is that happening? Why do we not see a balance? Why do we see institutions like Sasol, Discovery in the past week having share schemes that only benefit black people and that disadvantage white, Indian and colored people and also other racial groups?
Okay, Ian, let me come in there. Ian, I need to come in. Ian,
from Africa.
Ian, I have to stop you. Let me. We can't have a one. Ian, can I just come in? I'm sorry. I think there is again a communication problem with regards to the sound. I accept that point, and I accept the fact, and you speaking about being the head of community safety, and all that's fine and good. Nobody's trying to detract from that. But I'm saying, and I don't want to make this into an AfriForum debate, we need to get back to the issue of land reform, but it's all tied up, and there's a cross-pollination. The point, for example, as much as you may be doing good, and certainly there's a degree of positivity, the point at the end of the day is that a lot of that is in fact undone by the point I basically raised. I mean, the fact that if Adams is repeatedly, for example, and of course you've got the right to speak who you want to, but if he's repeatedly giving interviews to someone like Stefan Molyneux, when you've got people like Lauren Southern, who comes and does a documentary called Farmlands, which paints the picture of, for example, a genocide. You may not have done that. She does that in many respects. I'm just curious to know, let's kind of look at the issues that we're facing. For example, let me ask you clearly up front, a group called Saitlanders, a town called Oranje, as AfriForum, for example, in support of such groups and communities? I mean, it's a simple question. I understand the point that you're trying. I'm not trying to demean or paint a bleak picture, but we need to probe these issues because it's critical in the entire discourse. Would you, for example, support the group called Saitlanders? Do you support the town called Oranje? Do you believe that they have the right to exist in the context of South Africa today?
Well, I can answer that very clearly to you. Once again, I have to say this first, and I need to put it on record. I really find it very strange that a land interview or a farm murder interview is now becoming an AfriForum interrogation. Regarding groups like the Saitlanders and co., we do not associate with those groups. We never have. And you can go and listen and bring me the evidence where Ernst Roots or Kali Kriel or myself spoke about genocide or were in support of Lauren Southern. I think you're making sweeping statements. You're making generalizations without having the correct facts. I don't think you've been to half of the structures of AfriForum that you are referring to. And I think it's time that you get a more objective approach when it comes to AfriForum.
Okay, let me ask you, let's go to the land debate. In the land reform debate, one of the issues raised by Adams Roots, for example, in terms of land reform and the whole notion of opposition to expropriation, he gives a picture that, and this is, again, I'm going to paraphrase it, so correct me if I'm wrong, but he gives a picture that land in South Africa was obtained in three matters. One, land was vacant, it was basically available. Two, land was basically got through negotiations. And three, he refers to as most controversial, land was acquired through conquest. Now, I'm going to probe that particular issue, but as I've told and been informed now, we have to go for a quick ad break. When we come back, I'm going to get back to you on that particular point. I'm going to ask you to be brief. Advocate Dominic, I'm going to get your response. I'll ask you to be brief. We'll be back shortly. Welcome back to our Beg to Differ, and we're having an interesting debate with Ian Cameron from AfriForum and Advocate Dumini from the Christian Lawyers Association. Ian, just to come back, and again, please be brief. Ernst Roots, and this goes to the core of the issue, because the argument is the dominant idiom since 1652 is that the settler imposed force upon the native majority through force of arms. And so Ernst's argument is that land was obtained in three forms or three means, and that the third form, obtaining of land through conquest, which he views as most controversial. I just want to probe this idea. Why does he view that as most controversial? And does he believe, is AfriForum's official position on this, is that that no land was in fact stolen, or that there may be some land that was stolen, or some land conquered through conquest? I just want to know your kind of official position on that particular point. I just need to ask you to be brief as well on that issue.
No, and I think once again, your facts aren't straight. I think you should go and watch the video again. Aaron said that in certain cases there was conquest, in certain cases land was taken, in some cases it was with agreement, and in other cases the land was empty. If you go and look at the real history, and this is the frustration, we recently had a meeting with the Khoisan leaders at the AfriForum head office because they aren't recognized by the government as being the first cultural or racial or whatever you want to call them group that was occupying certain parts of South Africa. They were a nomad tribe, as were the majority of other tribes, but every single other tribe except for the Khoisan came from the northwest of Africa and slowly migrated down to the south. So the perception that is being created that all land was occupied or the majority land was occupied is completely false, as would be the perception in saying that every single piece of land was obtained through agreement or every single piece of land was supposedly stolen.
Okay.
So we see a lot of sweeping statements.
No, well, Ian, I don't think. Ian, let me just come in. I don't think I did tell you that I was paraphrasing, and I did point out that Adams did point out that there was land obtained through agreement, land that was vacant, and he describes the third form of obtaining land, conquest, as being the most controversial. That's what he said to the Parliamentary Review Committee. So I don't think I've misquoted him, but just coming back to this, Advocate Dominic, again, what's your position on this land debate? The argument is that there's a protectionist forum that's looking at the rights of private property. What is your concern?
I believe that private property is very, very important, and I actually believe personally that the Constitution doesn't need an amendment. And I think we're actually going
Well, that's what we discussed last week, that there is no necessity for the review of Section 25 of the Constitution as such.
But clearly, there's a pulling and a playing with votes, and the President has to do something. And so there's a debate that's been taken away from the
I think one thing we are clear, and I think Ian may agree with us on this point, is that very much so, that the ANC is not really interested in the issue of land reform, but are using this as a means to strategically garner votes for 2019. I mean, by virtue of the fact that the past decade under Zuma has been an absolute political disaster. And so since you've got the opposition, the EFF, and now the ANC is jumping on this bandwagon, but in reality, nothing will be done. And that's the whole problem, is that there is a concern by groups like AfriForum, but from our perspective, looking at how the ANC's policies are, there's no real concern about the poorest of the poor, those at the lower ends of society. In fact, when land is repossessed, a lot of this land goes to comrades and cadres, and more often than not to people who have absolutely no actual know-how of how to farm land.
I think everybody's in agreement, and I think AfriForum agree as well, that land reform is written into the Constitution. We need to figure out how to do this, and this is where we're floundering at the moment. And at the moment, we have the extreme left saying, well, we're simply going to nationalize land. The ANC sitting in the middle, not telling us exactly what they're going to do. And the perception that's created from white protection groups, including groups that I associate with, are saying, but we must protect property rights at all costs. I mean, what I'm calling for is people to start engaging and seeing how can we move forward. We had our CODESA. It doesn't help we try and rediscover the history of South Africa. It's very difficult. Everybody's rewriting history.
There is history. I mean, and the history that is presented by Africa is what the history we learned, which some would argue is revisionist in a sense. But
sorry, we also finding a history that says Wakanda is real and Africa was perfect before the white man arrived, which is obviously not true. We've got wars and strifes and counter wars and tribes chasing each other out here. And I think what happened at CODESA is we said, we're going to protect property rights and we're going to move forward. What's happening now is exactly what I think was not the intention at CODESA, was to keep going back and trying to rewrite history to convince each other of the different histories. We're not going to win that way.
We're not going to win that particular debate on that way. Ian, just one thing, Ian, and something which is obviously of concern. Obviously, you've mentioned a lot of positivity with your with your movement and your group. But here's one issue, and again, I'm just getting what I've received from the mainstream press. Recently, about a month, I think 2 ago, the Zulu King, Goodwill Zwelithini, announced a kind of a partnership in some capacity with your particular movement, and particularly I think it was looking at land under the Ingonyama Trust. I'm just basically querying that the kind of legitimacy or credibility of the partnership, because if on the one hand you are talking about being a civil rights movement, being a pressure group, looking of course at the rights of minority farmers, which is fair, and I have absolutely no problem with that. Why would you partner with a monarchy, an individual like King Goodwill Zwelithini, who is receiving millions of rands by government, that's our money, taxpayers' money, and wants to partner in many respects with AfriForum, from my perspective at least, looking at it, for the purposes of just simply protecting his own domain, because the land under the Ingonyama Trust and the land surrounding doesn't belong to the African people, it belongs to him. He wants to protect himself. Why would you partner with, for example, the king? Does that not just simply sustain the establishment and monarchist view?
Well, first of all, I would just once again like to set the record straight. Just now there was a comment made that the ANC are kind of in the middle between organizations. I think that is very far off. The ANC, and specifically President Cyril Ramaphosa about 2 months ago, actually no, a bit longer, in June, made it very clear, even before the Constitutional Review Committee process was completed, that he would be changing the Constitution. So regardless of the technicalities or specifics, they are going to change the Constitution whether we like it or not. On top of that, I would just like to say regarding the King Goodwill Zwelithini, we've spoken with him, we've met with the Swazi King as well, as we have spoken with many different organizations, including the ANC and the EFF. Regarding this specific thing and specifically land expropriation without compensation, we are taking hands on that. We never said, and as the Zulu King rightly said at his last birthday party, that we don't need to agree on everything, but that there are certain topics that we could work together on. So if the tax money is one problem, we can take that on, as we've done with ANC and recently with our private prosecution unit, as we've looked at SARS, at Julius Malema, at several different institutions, at Thandi Modise, provincial governments in Northwest, and so forth, as we will do with any other institution. So we don't need to agree on everything, but one thing that we agree on is that land expropriation without compensation would be detrimental to the entire country and to every single individual, except maybe the rich political elite that belong to the ruling party.
Okay, Ian, just one thing. I mean, you speak about the fact that the president has basically made his intention clear to amend the Constitution. This is something that both of us within the legal fraternity, myself and Advocate Domini, have discussed, that amending the Constitution on that particular point, land expropriation without compensation, the law itself, and this is the bulwark, which in my opinion, why the Constitution may not be amended, is that how would the law cater for the assets on the farm and improvements made on the land? There's no answer in respect of that. And secondly, the point is that South African agricultural debt, land, is heavily indebted, and the problem is that farm debt linked to the actual land through title deeds, they've been secured through loans. So if one speaks about amending the Constitution, it's not going to happen overnight, because there are practicalities that can simply not become overcome. So the concern that the Constitution is going to be amended, and the fact that many within the legal fraternity believe that within Section 25, there is a provision which certainly opens up the ambit that in certain circumstances, land can in fact be expropriated without compensation. So my take on this is that it's not just simply a foregone conclusion. Amending the Constitution has a number of legal ramifications which jurists and certainly the courts have not basically ruled upon, which is going to create a number of other problems.
Yeah, well, I think if we were thinking of practicalities as a problem-solving mechanism, then the Constitution wouldn't even be considered to have been changed. If we look at the rest of the world, there's not one country that has been successful with land expropriation without compensation, and not one of the models that our government has suggested or discussed has been successful anywhere else on the globe. So that's the first point. The second point is there's not one country in this world that has an agricultural sector that does not farm on debt. That is the way you farm on a large scale. So that doesn't carry weight. I understand and I agree with you on the fact that it will take time. That's true. But the damage that is being done by the statements that are being made by specific political organizations and groups is huge. Once again, I would like to refer to a case that we had about 2-3 months ago, where a black farmer, I would like to repeat that, a black farmer, just for anyone who might think that we don't represent different people in South Africa, was represented by AfriForum after he was wished away or showed away by the Democratic Alliance, by COPE, by the EFF, by the ANC, when they asked for help and when his land was illegally invaded. The police didn't act, and AfriForum brought a court application to make sure that the police acted. The reason why I refer to this example is that in the Western Cape alone, there's been an increase by more than 250 cases in the past year compared to the previous year when it comes to land invasion. So the statements that are being made are already encouraging illegal land invasion in the country.
Okay,
and we can't think that that doesn't link with each other.
Okay, but hold on a second.
Every statement that's being made.
Ian, just quickly, the point I need to establish, and I'm going to get back to you, Advocate Dominique, because I want you to clarify this point. Do you accept the point and the premise, because this is what we're banding around, there's statistics from AfriForum, statistics from AgriSA, do you accept the fact that 80%, or at least 80%, 87% of this land is deemed as agricultural land, and that 80% of that land is in fact owned, by and large, by white families, white farmers? I mean, the fact is that the majority of the population, that's just simply the reality. Black people do not own as much land as white people. Now, there is an inequality here, and there's a number of factors that we can debate on, but how do we address this issue? I mean, are you saying land expropriation, then wood compensation? Who's going to pay? Is the state going to foot the bill? How do you basically overcome the existing status quo? Because do you accept the premise that the majority of the people in this country are landless? How do we address that problem? Because that is a critical issue. And what does AfriForum say in terms of some of the kind of key practical solutions in addressing that fundamental problem?
Well, let me ask you the question. Why are you only asking the question now? We say that there must be some form of restitution that should take place, but for the past 22 years, 97% of land reform has failed because the state is corrupt and they haven't looked at the system properly. They haven't.
I agree with you. Yeah, but
those black farmers that were meant to get an equal opportunity were showed away by a government that lacks the knowledge in order to farm properly. So
Ian, I agree with you. Ian, I have to stop you. Ian,
in the way that it should be approached, then we wouldn't have a problem.
Ian, I agree with you. I agree with you on that point that the ANC government's policies of the past 24 years have been a dismal failure. Advocate Dominique may disagree with me. I agree with that point, and I agree that now it's coming to the fore, rightly or wrongly, whether it's a political maneuver by the ANC, I believe it may be. But the issue is, again, you have a situation, there's been a total of, in terms of stats, 17.439 million hectares have been transferred from white ownership since 1994. That's equivalent to about 21% of the total amount of farm land in South Africa, field land. The question I need to ask and address is that farmland, agricultural land, the majority of it is owned by white farmers. How do we address this issue? Should blacks not be allowed to own that? And how do we kind of create this kind of egalitarian distribution? I just want to focus and find out what the policies are. But as I'm told by my producer, we just have to go for a quick ad break, and when we're back, I'm going to come back and we're going to ask you to address that particular issue. We'll be back shortly. Welcome back to I Beg to Differ, and we engage in a robust debate on land reform and other salient issues. And with me in the studios have been Advocate Dominique and Ian Cameron from AfriForum. Ian, just before we went for the break, I think that was a pertinent question that I raised, and I think you would probably agree with me, is that there was a television debate, just to amplify this, between Cornelius Janse van Rensburg from the Afrikaans business right watchdog called AfriSake, and the EFF spokesman in Gauteng, Mandisa Mashego. And the whole focus of that debate focused around the fact, whether the figures are accurate or not, but I'm saying these are probably approximates, that 80% of the country's land is deemed as agricultural land. 80% of that land is owned by 40,000 white families. Now, whether it's 40,000, whether it's 10,000, whether it's 30,000, the point is, do you accept this premise that the large majority of agricultural land is owned by white farmers, rightly or wrongly, and that the majority of black people in South Africa are landless? And the question I need to ask is, what are the policies, or what's the trajectory that AfriForum would put forth in redressing this clear inequality?
Well, I think, first of all, I would like to correct you. I think the statistic that you're using is the same one that the EFF and sometimes the ANC used during the Constitutional Reform Review Committee. Only 22% of land in South Africa is owned like that, and the ANC is currently the largest individual landowner in the country, with a very large amount of that land not belonging to anyone, and that no one has a title deed for it. So what AfriForum said is that the current reform project that exists for the past 20 years should have been fast-tracked, it should have been put pressure on, it should have done in an equal way, willing buyer, willing seller, and to make sure that the correct people have some form of reform, some form of restitution. The most important part is, and this was found by the Institute for Racial Relations, is that the majority of people who went to land reform wanted the money and not the land. The last survey that the Institute for Racial Relations did showed that land was actually quite low on the discussion list for the majority of South Africans, and in fact most of them just want jobs, less crime and less drugs. So if we consider those points, it's quite clear that we are not in a country that everyone now wants land, but it is important that people who do want land should get an equal opportunity. They should get a chance to become part of the economy, and that they should get title deeds and not just fall into the hole that the ANC has created, where they only create trusts and that the people can't sustainably take part in a capitalist and a economically viable economy.
Okay, just quickly on that particular point, because I've heard this before, and I just want you to be brief because I'm going to get Advocate Dominic. You stated, and this has been challenged, that the vast majority of people are more interested in, as I understand, urbanization, moving out into the urban areas, and if they have a choice between land and money, they would take the money. Now, the point is, where do you get the statistics from? I'm just curious to know, where are the stats from? And how was this determination made? I mean, was there kind of a mass survey conducted by AfriForum? Where do these stats come that the vast majority of people will opt for urbanization and would opt, in fact, for taking the money and leaving the land aside? Because land is asset, and people realize that. So where do you get the stats from?
Well, as I just told you, and I'm quite surprised that you haven't looked this up yourself before having a discussion like this, it comes from Stats SA, it comes from the Institute for Security Studies, the Institute for Race Relations, and then also from the last census that was done, and the last national survey by the Institute for Race Relations. So it's not even relevant to AfriForum. The fact of the matter is that these statistics speak for themselves, and I think that there's a political minority that are created.
Okay, here's the point, Advocate Dominic. You've heard what Ian had to say on a number of issues. For example, people want money as opposed to land. There's a move towards urbanization. In fact, the reality is that the South African government owns the majority of the land. How true and salient are these issues? Are these on point?
Well, I think they're very, very big issues, and I think some of them are true. I've been involved in land claims where the claimants want the money and not the land. And I think this is a very worrying issue for us.
That's in land restitution cases.
Those are land restitutions. But now we're talking about the next phase of land reform, which is land redistribution. So we're not talking about giving people money here. We're talking about a new phase. I agree with Ian on the issue of the stats. I think the stats that the government and I think the stats that the EFF are throwing around on land ownership are completely skewed. I think a proper land audit, which has already been done, I think Agri-SA have done wonderful work in this regard, is showing us a different pattern. The question remains, we have gross inequality, we have rampant poverty. How are we going to address these issues? That, to me, is where we're going. The land issue actually becomes a proxy debate. It's
a symptom, basically, of a far bigger problem, in my opinion.
That's it. People are recognizing. Jeremy Cronin has said it's a proxy debate. We've had Max du Preez recognizing this. We need to start talking about why is land so important suddenly. We need to start talking about...
What's the reason, in your opinion?
Well, we need to talk about black pain. We need to talk about black dignity. We need to talk about some of the things that we as a white community, and I point to myself, haven't necessarily...
you're a farmer, certainly.
Exactly.
You believe you're part of a privileged class.
I recognize incredible privilege that I have from many things that I received in this country. But I also see with my privilege comes a duty to build back into this country, to give back what I can, and to try and work to build a new South Africa, to build a country where we have equal opportunities. But we need to start talking about some of the issues that we as a white community, I speak for myself, maybe others have grappled with it. The black pain, the indignity of being removed from land. Have we grappled with it? Have we truly grappled with some of the issues that came out of the TRC? And this is the next process, and I think the black community are asking us as white community to recognize some of these injustices, recognize the pain, and not just say, we're holding on to our assets. Yes, I believe our assets should be protected. I believe there should be a protection of property rights, but how are we moving forward with them? And how are we going to move forward with reconciliation?
That's the whole point, Ian. I mean, what Advocate Domini is pointing out here is that this concomitant responsibility that needs to be there amongst minority classes, particularly in the fact that there's been a lot of black indignity, there's been poverty, rampant oppression. All that we're facing, as bad and as corrupt as the ANC has been over the past decade and so on, these issues need to be addressed. And I'm saying that certainly people have their own right to private property being protected. But again, you don't come to the issue. How do we address the particular situation? And I'm saying the willing buyer, willing seller model will not work. It's failed to work. That's what they want to do in corporate over the past 24 years. Willing buyer, willing seller model has failed to work. So how do we address the inequality? And do you accept the fact that black indignity, oppression of other classes on racial grounds have led to the position that we are in? Do you accept that? And I need to ask, what do you have as a solution to basically solve the inherent problem that we basically developed, which has reached a crescendo now in 2018?
Well, I think you've decided on my behalf. I don't accept all of that. I accept some of it. I believe that the
what don't you accept?
What don't you accept? Ian,
what don't you accept? Ian, I need to ask you clearly.
Their race or their language. I believe that everyone should have an equal opportunity to education. They should all have an equal opportunity to have, for example, land or some way of taking part in the economy. And as I've said about 7 or 8 times during this interview, we need to find a sustainable view or sustainable approach to benefit all people in the country and not one at the cost of another. If we're going to start pulling different groups down at the cost of another, we won't see a perspiring country. In fact, we'll see a country in demise. We'll see a country that decreases in economic welfare. And we should go and knock on the door of government and ask, why hasn't the land reform process worked? But to now jump to an extreme and simply take something that doesn't belong to someone will definitely not bear fruit and will only deteriorate
I accept
the economy.
that. Yes, Ian, I accept. I understand the point, and that's not the point. I mean, in fact, you don't even know my position on land expropriation. We've been having this debate prior to this, and I don't think you're aware of our positions. But the point I need to go again is that you say you disagree with something that I said about indignity. I presume certain things. Do you accept the fact that the playing fields were not level? I understand the argument about free economic opportunities, free rights, private ownership of property, the protection of private property. All that is fine and well and good. But the playing fields in the South African context for decades was not equal. So to now assume an equal playing field in terms of equal opportunities detracts from the point that at some point in time there was a non-egalitarian society. Do you accept this premise that pre-1994 society was not egalitarian? There were inequalities that existed. And my question is, if you accept that premise, how do we address this? Because the willing buyer, willing seller model has not worked. The ANC has failed. We agree with that. I agree with you. Advocate Domini agrees with me. My question I need to ask is, what are the solutions to address the inequality?
The willing buyer, willing seller model has worked. It depended on the piece of government that approached the problem. If you go look at the Western Cape, the majority, or let's rather say a large amount of land reform projects were very successful, and those farmers are now farming sustainably and building a prosperous future in South Africa. So it can work. We need to go and knock on the door of government and say, why haven't you trained people? Why has land reform failed? Land reform didn't fail because land wasn't given to people. Land reform failed failed because people didn't know what to do with the land that they received. And if they were taught to do that properly, we would have seen sustainable farms. Now, instead, we see a massive urbanization in the country that is estimated by Stats SA and by the Institute for Race Relations that will only stop in about 2030, which will cause for further demise. So let's talk solutions. First of all, I believe, as I said already, education systems need to be sharpened. We look at the majority of basic education in South Africa as a total and utter failure. Instead of now saying, how can we build sustainable models like many of the Afrikaans schools have as part of the state, we now say, let's destroy Afrikaans schools because other schools aren't as good in many cases. We should say, how can we learn from each other? How can we add to each other's success? What can we learn from each other? And that way we can go forward. But at the moment, we are simply saying, let's punish one group. For example, me. I didn't play any part in apartheid. I don't own any property. But now I am also being disadvantaged because of something that was done.
I agree with that, Ian.
But now we're disadvantaged people who want to pull together.
Ian, we're coming to an end. Ian, we're coming to an end. Just one quick last question. Be as brief as possible because I'm going to give you the last opportunity and then Advocate Dumley, we have to close. According to the United Nations, certain acts, and hear me clearly, certain acts that are deliberately committed as part of a widespread systematic attack or an individual act or a policy against an identifiable population was viewed and is defined as a crime against humanity. Do you accept the premise that apartheid was in fact a crime against humanity?
I do not. Let me just finish. Let me just explain it to you. As Kali Kriel clearly said, that there are certain parts of apartheid that definitely played a role in that. He didn't say that it was completely not a crime, or he didn't deny the wrongdoings that was done. He simply said that if you compare it to something like what Hitler did with the Jews during the Second World War, you cannot call it the same thing. And I agree with what he said. I think just to clarify on this entire interview, it was told to me that we would be having a decent discussion on political issues and specifically land reform.
But did we not have a decent discussion, Ian? I thought my questions were fair to you, Ian. Did we not have a decent discussion? Did we not have a decent discussion, Ian? Last point, Advocate Dumley. Last point. I mean, Ian is of the view that we never had a decent discussion. I think he's gone off now of the particular program, but I don't know why you choose to run. Did we not have a decent discussion? Are the questions probing, and what's your last point and comments on this particular issue?
I think the issue and the discussion is huge, and I think it needs to continue.
Were my questions fair?
I think there were a number of fair questions. I agree with Ian on the issue of the willing buyer, willing seller. I think that system can still go ahead.
Sure.
Just by the way, I beg to differ. I think we've had other problems in the system that collapse it. But I think we need to dig deeper here. We need to dig deeper in what do we want to do? How do we find each other? And what is the road forward for us as South Africans? As a landowner, as a friend of mine says, I have a dog in the fight because I have invested in land. So I have an interest here and I want to see this work. And I don't want to see us polarized, and I don't want to see people fighting about issues that are non-issues. But I think we're in danger of a society that is pulling in different directions.
And I think that polarization will lead possibly to eventual destruction of society if we let it run loose.
The worst case scenario people have asked me, as I've spoken in various places on land reform, is full-blown civil war.
That's a possibility.
And I've heard it from the right wing and the left wing. And we don't want to go there.
Certainly.
And we've got to do whatever we can to prevent this.
Well, thank you. I want to thank you very much, Advocate Dumley. I can't thank Ian. He's left the program after this discussion. But we want to thank you, the viewer, for joining us in this robust debate. We've run out of time. Join us next week for more hard-hitting debate on I Beg to Differ. Till next time, this is Yusuf Ismail on behalf of ITV signing off. Greetings of peace and good evening.